It was the year 1021, on the northern tip of Newfoundland. A small band of Norse sailors stood at the edge of a continent no European had ever named. A forge, 8 timber houses, iron nails cooling in the Atlantic air, and as you already know, they had reached the Americas nearly 500 years before Columbus was born. And then they packed up their tools and left. Why would anyone discover an entire new world and simply walk away from it? Well, that's exactly why you should stay with us. To understand why they abandoned a continent, we have to go back to where the journey actually started, on the freezing rim of the Old One. The story begins in Greenland, on a coast of black rock and ice that should never have held a farm. Around the year 985, a man named Erik the Red led settlers west to build a colony there. He had not chosen Greenland because it was green. He had been banished from Iceland for killing 2 men, and he gave the frozen island its hopeful name on purpose, because the sagas say he believed people would follow him somewhere that sounded inviting. For some reasons, it worked. Hundreds of Norse crossed with him and carved farms into the few green valleys. They raised cattle, hunted seal and walrus, and traded ivory back to Europe. But Greenland was a knife-edge existence. Every plank of timber and every iron tool had to be shipped in across hundreds of miles of brutal sea. Driftwood and the occasional trading ship were almost the only wood they ever saw. For a people who measured wealth in wood and iron, scarcity was the defining fact of life. Erik had a son named Leif, raised in a household where survival meant reading the wind and the ice better than the next family did. To these people, a ship was not an adventure. It was a tool, trusted the way a modern pilot trusts an aircraft. And out past the western horizon, sailors kept coming home with the same strange report. There was land out there, forested land, and nobody had set foot on it. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, the first European to see North America never meant to. A trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course in a hard north wind, saw a coastline that was low and forested and completely wrong for glacier-bound Greenland. Then he did something that tells you everything about the Norse mind. He did not land. He had cargo to deliver, so he noted the strange shore and sailed on. He had found a continent and filed it away as a navigation error. Years later, around the year 1000, Leif Erikson bought Bjarni's old ship and set out to find the land Bjarni had refused to explore. This was not a leap of faith. It was a calculated voyage, retracing a known report in a proven vessel. Leif found 3 new lands and named each for what it offered. A barren place of flat stone he called Helluland. A flat wooded coast he named Markland, the land of forests, a name that meant everything to timber-starved Greenlanders. And further south, a place so mild it stunned them, with salmon and grass that stayed green into winter. He called it Vinland. There they built a base, timber houses with thick turf walls, exactly the way they built at home. They wintered over, they explored, and Leif sailed back with a hold full of timber and a story worth more than the cargo. The land was real, it was reachable, and it was rich. Over the next decade, more ships followed, each crossing roughly 2,000 miles of open water without a compass, by the sun, the swell, and the flight of birds. And if you remember, there is also a video about this on this channel. These were not lost wanderers. They were running a sea road, deliberately, the way a freight captain runs a shipping lane. But the same sagas record the first crack. The land was not empty. People already lived there, and the Norse called them the Skrællingar. What the Norse built at the edge of the Americas was modest in size, but staggering in meaning. The settlement archaeologists later uncovered at Lance Meadows held 8 timber and turf buildings, raised in the exact style the Norse used in Greenland and Iceland. There were halls for dozens of people, storage rooms, and workshops. This was no overnight camp. It was a planned base built by people who knew how to survive a hard northern winter. At its heart sat a forge. Archaeologists found slag, iron debris, and the remains of a furnace, the earliest known ironworking anywhere in the Americas. The Norse had dug bog ore, burned charcoal, and smelted their own iron on a continent that had never seen the process. To this channel, that detail is the whole point. These were not raiders stumbling onto a beach. They used that iron the way they always did, forging the nails and rivets to repair the ships that had carried them across. These were not raiders stumbling onto a beach. They were engineers running a remote outpost 2,000 miles from home. And consider what it took just to arrive. There was no compass in the Norse world of 1021. They crossed the open Atlantic by reading the height of the sun, the run of the swell, and the path of seabirds toward land. The settlement was the easy part. The road that led to it was the real achievement. Other finds named who was there. A bronze cloak pin and a soapstone spindle whorl used to spin wool, which meant women lived at the site, not just a war band of men. Then came the discovery that pushed the story far beyond Newfoundland. Among the remains lay butternuts, a kind of walnut that does not grow in Newfoundland and never has. 1,000 years ago, the nearest trees stood hundreds of miles to the south, around the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Someone had sailed down there, gathered them, and carried them home. Lance Oaks Meadows was never the limit of Vinland. It was the doorway. The sagas supply the human scale. They describe a colonizing expedition led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, dozens of settlers bringing cattle, and a woman named Gudrid who gave birth there to a son, Snorri, by the saga's account the first child of European descent born in the Americas. Cattle in the grass, a forge throwing sparks, a newborn in a turf house, an ocean from any other European on Earth. Everything a colony could need was in place. What none of them could see was that almost none of it would outlast a single generation. So here is the question that has puzzled people for 1,000 years. The Norse found a new world, with timber, iron ore, and mild winters. They built a base, smelted metal, and raised children there. And then, within a few short years, they abandoned it completely and never came back. This was not a colony wiped out in a catastrophe. The archaeology suggests Lance Oaks Meadows was lived in for only a handful of years, between 3 and 10, and was then deliberately left. The Norse did not vanish. They loaded their ships and sailed back to the frozen rock of Greenland on purpose. For centuries, nobody in Europe even knew this had happened because the Spanish conquerors did not begin crossing the Atlantic until 400 years later. And when the sagas were finally read by modern scholars, the popular response was simply to disbelieve them. Vinland was a myth. The consensus held no more real than a tale of trolls. A civilization documented its own discovery of a continent, described the coastline, the forge, even a childbirth. And the modern world's first instinct was to call the eyewitnesses liars. The truth, when the soil finally confirmed it, was more human than the myth. The Norse did not lose Vinland because they were weak. They left because the arithmetic never worked. Greenland was a tiny society of a few thousand people clinging to a hostile coast. It did not have the surplus population to ship across the Atlantic and defend a colony 2,000 miles away. And the land was not empty. The first meetings with the Skrælingjar turned violent, and for a few dozen settlers facing a large population on its own ground, weeks from any help, the conclusion was obvious. The reward was real, the risk was fatal. This was not a defeat. It was a cost-benefit analysis, and survival won. They did not even need to stay. A ship could fetch timber from Markland and turn straight back, no fort and no war required. With Vinland abandoned, the entire Norse foothold in the west now rested on Greenland alone, and Greenland was running out of time. Over the following centuries, the climate cooled, the walrus ivory trade that funded the colony collapsed, and the ships from Europe came less and less. The last written record of the Greenland Norse is a wedding at Hvalsey Church in 1408. After that, silence. That slow death is a whole story of its own, and we have told it in full in our video on the disappearance of the Greenland Vikings. What matters here is what died with them. The knowledge that Europeans had reached the Americas never spread through the rest of Europe. It died on a frozen island with the people who held it. So when an Italian navigator named Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Caribbean in 1492, he genuinely believed he was the first, and so did Europe. The Norse had gotten there nearly 5 centuries earlier, smelted iron and buried their dead in American soil, and the world had completely forgotten. But there was one thing the centuries could not erase: the ground remembered. In 1960, a Norwegian explorer named Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad, followed the logic of the old sagas to the tip of Newfoundland and found grassy ridges near a small fishing village called Lans o Meadows. Their dig turned a 1,000-year-old legend into the only confirmed Norse site in the Americas, listed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 1978. The eyewitnesses had been telling the truth all along. There is a version of this story where leaving was a tragedy, a once-in-history discovery thrown away. But there is another, the one the archaeology quietly supports, where leaving was the rational choice of a small, clear-eyed people who decided that a forge, a few good years, and a safe route home were enough. Maybe the Norse did not lose the New World. Maybe they were simply the first to understand what it would cost to hold, and the first to walk away with their eyes open.